It's an honor and pleasure to introduce our main speaker, author of the new Pearl Harbor, Disturbing Questions About the Bush Administration and 9/11, and the 9/11 Commission Report, Omissions and Distortions, a critique of the Keene-Zelikow Report. When people face a problem, they usually ask, what can I do? However, when confronted with 9/11 truths that shatter their worldviews, people must ask themselves, who am I? Dr. David Ray Griffin has spent much of his life examining questions about who we are and our relationship with the universe. A professor of philosophy of religion and theology emeritus at Claremont School of Theology and Claremont Graduate University, co-director of the Center for Process Studies. He has authored 15 books, edited a dozen more, and has authored over 100 articles and chapters, presented innumerable papers and lectures. He's renowned for his theological work and a recipient of the Book Prize of the Scientific and Medical Network. His forthcoming books include 9/11 and the American Empire, Intellectuals Speak Out, and Christian Faith and the Truth Behind 9/11, a call to reflection and action. In Process Theology, an introductory exposition, he and his co-author, John B. Cobb Jr., present a way of understanding God's existence and our own as a co-creative process where humans individually and collectively have the freedom, responsibility, and opportunity to imagine and realize a better or worse future for all. Dr. Griffin has overcome the central political and spiritual challenge confronting humanity at this eternally critical moment: fear. In 1976, he and Cobb wrote, "The choice of life, which is the choice of God's call, is the highest freedom in itself. Hope grows with the ability to respond. Despair grows with the self-chosen closing in of horizons. To be responsible is not finally to shoulder an unendurable burden. It is to share in the divine adventure in the world, although its outcome is never assured. In itself, it is joyful. The one who experiences the joy of this participation in the divine life hopes urgently for success, but accepts the risk that the only reward may be in the joy itself. By deconstructing the foundational lies of the war on terrorism, courageously dispelling fear to champion truth and light the path towards a hopeful future, Dr. Griffin is an inspiration to all who reject fear, terror, war, and lies, and to all who cherish life, health, peace, and truth. The fact that he can enjoy challenging the most threatening empire the world has ever seen makes it possible and compelling for all of us to join him in this journey. Please welcome Dr. David Ray Griffin.
Good evening. Although I have given many lectures about 9/11, I had, prior to this one, never devoted an entire lecture to simply summarizing what I take to be the strongest evidence against the official account of 9/11. Although I'm a philosopher of religion and a theologian, I've spent most of my time the last 3 years working on 9/11, studying it, writing about it, talking about it. In this lecture, I will try to make clear why I have devoted so much time and energy to this topic. I will do so in terms of the distinction between myth and reality. I'm here using the term myth in two senses. In one sense, a myth is an idea that, while widely believed, is false, does not correspond with reality. In a deeper sense, which is employed by students of religion, a myth serves as an orienting and mobilizing story for a people, a story that reminds them who they are and why they do what they do. When a story is called a myth in this sense, which can be called myth with a capital M, the focus is not on the story's relation to reality, but on its function. This orienting and mobilizing function is possible because the myth in this sense has a religious overtone. It is a sacred story. However, although to note that a story functions as a myth in the religious sense is not to say anything about its truth, a story cannot function this way unless it is believed to be true in the community or the nation. It is not a matter of debate. If some people have the bad taste to raise the question of the truth of the sacred story, the keepers of the faith do not enter into debate with them. They ignore them or denounce them as blasphemers.
It is wrong, blasphemous, and sinful for you to suggest, imply, or help other people come to the conclusion that the U.S. government killed 3,000 of its own citizens.
According to the official story about 9/11, America, because of its goodness, was attacked by fanatical Arab Muslims who hate our freedoms. This story has clearly functioned as a sacred myth since that fateful day. And this function appears to have been closely, carefully orchestrated. The very next day, President Bush announced his intention to lead a monumental struggle of good versus evil. Then on September 13, he declared the following day would be a national day of prayer and remembrance for the victims of the terrorist attacks. And on that next day, the President himself, surrounded by Billy Graham, a cardinal, a rabbi, and an imam, delivered a sermon in the National Cathedral, saying, "Our responsibility to history is already clear, to answer these attacks and rid the world of evil. War has been waged against us by stealth and deceit and murder. This nation is peaceful, but fierce when stirred to anger. In every generation, the world has produced enemies of human freedom. They have attacked America because we are freedom's home and defender. And the commitment of our fathers is now the calling of our time. We ask Almighty God to watch over our nation and grant us patience and resolve in all that is to come, and may He always guide our country. God bless America." Through this unprecedented event, in which the President of the United States issued a declaration of war from a cathedral, French author Thierry Masson observed in 2002, the American government consecrated its version of the events. From then on, any questioning of the official truth would be seen as sacrilege. That attitude has remained dominant in the public sphere until this day, as the official account has continued to serve as a sacred story. When people raise questions about this story, they are either ignored, ridiculed as conspiracy theorists, or, as Charlie Sheen has recently learned, personally attacked. When anyone asks what right the administration has to invade and occupy other countries, to imprison people indefinitely without due process, or even to ignore various laws, the answer is always the same: 9/11. Those who believe that U.S. law and international law should be respected are dismissed as having a pre-9/11 mindset. Given the role that the official account of 9/11 has played, the most important question before our country today is whether this account, besides being a myth in the religious sense, is also a myth in the pejorative sense. That is, it is simply false. As a philosopher of religion, I would emphasize that the fact that a story has served as a religious myth does not necessarily mean that it fails to correspond with reality. Many religious accounts have at least a kernel of truth that can be defended in rational debate. In many cases, however, stories that have served as religious myths cannot stand up to rational scrutiny. When such a story is stripped of its halo and treated simply as a theory rather than an unquestionable dogma, it cannot be defended as the best theory to account for the relevant evidence. The official account of 9/11 is such a theory. When challenges to it are not treated as blasphemy, it can easily be seen to be composed of a number of ideas that are myths in the sense of not corresponding with reality. Using the word myth from now on only in this pejorative sense, I will discuss 9 of the major myths contained in the official story about 9/11. I will thereby show that the official account cannot be defended in light of the relevant evidence against the main alternative account, according to which 9/11 was an inside job, orchestrated by people within our own government. I will begin by looking at a few myths that prevent many people from even looking at this evidence. Myth number one: our political and military leaders simply would not do such a thing. This idea is widely believed, but it is undermined by much evidence. The United States, like many other countries, has often used deceit to begin wars. For example, the Mexican War, with its false claim that Mexico had shed American blood on American soil. The Spanish-American War, with its Remember the Maine incidents. The war in the Philippines, with its false claim that the Filipinos fired the first shot. And the Vietnam War, with its Gulf of Tonkin hoax. The U.S. government has also sometimes organized false flag terrorist attacks, killing innocent civilians, then blaming the attacks on an enemy country or group, often by planting evidence. As Daniel Ganser has shown in his recent book, NATO's Secret Armies, NATO, guided by the CIA and the Pentagon, arranged many such attacks in Western European countries during the Cold War, in which hundreds of people were killed by bombs or hooded men with shotguns. These attacks were successfully blamed on communists and other leftists to discredit them in the eyes of the voting public. Finally, if it be thought that the U.S. military would not orchestrate such attacks against American citizens, one needs only to read the plans known as Operation Northwoods, which the Joint Chiefs of Staff worked up in 1962, shortly after Fidel Castro had overthrown the pro-American dictator Batista. This plan contained various pretexts which would provide justification for U.S. military intervention in Cuba. Some of them would have involved killing Americans. For example, I Remember the Maine incident. We could blow up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba. At this point, some people, having seen evidence that U.S. leaders would be morally capable of orchestrating 9/11, might avoid looking at the evidence by appeal to myth number two: our political and military leaders would have had no motive for orchestrating the 9/11 attacks. This myth was reinforced by the 9/11 Commission, while explaining that Al-Qaeda had ample motives for carrying out the attacks. This report mentions no motives that U.S. leaders might have had. But the alleged motives of Al-Qaeda, that it hated Americans and their freedoms, is dwarfed by a motive held by many members of the Bush-Cheney administration, the dream of establishing a global Pax Americana, the first all-inclusive empire in history. This dream has been articulated by many neoconservatives, or neocons, during the 1990s, after the disintegration of the Soviet Union made it seem possible. It was first officially articulated in the Defense Planning Guidance of 1992, drafted by Paul Wolfowitz on behalf of then Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney, a document that has been called a blueprint for permanent American global hegemony and Cheney's plan to rule the world. Achieving this goal would require four things. One of these was getting control of the world's oil, especially in Central Asia and the Middle East. And the Bush administration came to power with plans already made to attack Afghanistan and Iraq. The second requirement was a technological transformation of the military, in which fighting from space would become central. A third requirement was an enormous increase in military spending to pay for these new wars and the weaponization of space. The fourth need was to modify the doctrine of preemptive attack so that America would be able to attack other countries even if they presented no imminent threat. These four elements would require a fifth, an event that would make the American people ready to accept these imperialistic policies. As Zbigniew Brzezinski explained in his 1997 book, The Grand Chessboard, the American people, with their democratic instincts, are reluctant to authorize the money and human sacrifices necessary for imperial mobilization. And this refusal limits America's capacity for military intimidation. But this impediment could be overcome if there were a truly massive and widely perceived direct external threat, just as the American people were willing to enter World War II only after the shock effect of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The same idea was suggested in a 2000 document entitled Rebuilding America's Defenses, which was put out by a neocon think tank called the Project for the New American Century, many members of which, including Cheney, Rumsfeld, and Wolfowitz, became central members of the Bush administration. This document, referring to the goal of transforming the military, said that this process of transformation is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor. When the attacks of 9/11 occurred, they were treated like a new Pearl Harbor. Several members of the administration spoke of them as opportunities. Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld said that 9/11 created the kind of opportunities that World War II offered to refashion the world. It created in particular the opportunity to attack Afghanistan and Iraq, to increase the military budget enormously, to go forward with military transformation, and to turn the new idea of preemptive warfare into official doctrine. This doctrinal change was announced in the 2002 version of the National Security Strategy, which said that America will act against emerging threats before they are fully formed. So not only did the Bush administration reap huge benefits from 9/11, these were benefits that it had desired in advance. The idea that it would have had no motives for orchestrating 9/11 is a myth. But there is one more myth that keeps many people from looking at the evidence. This is myth number 3. Such a big operation involving so many people could not have been kept a secret because someone involved in it would have talked by now. This claim is based on a more general myth, which is that it is impossible for secret government operations to be kept secret very long because someone always talks. But how could one know this? If some big operations have remained secret until now, we, by definition, don't know about them. Moreover, we do know about some big operations that were kept secret as long as necessary, such as the Manhattan Project to create the atomic bomb, and the war in Indonesia in 1957, which the United States provoked, participated in, and then kept secret until 1995. Many more examples could be given. We can understand, moreover, why those with inside knowledge of 9/11 would not talk. At least most of them would have been people with the proven ability to keep secrets. Those who were directly complicit would also be highly motivated to avoid public disgrace and the gas chamber. Those people who had knowledge without being complicit could be induced to keep quiet by means of more or less subtle threats, such as, Joe, if you go forward with your plan to talk to the press, I don't know who is going to protect your wife and kids from some nutcase angered by your statement. Still another fact is that neither the government nor the mainstream press has, to say the least, shown any signs of wanting people to come forward. For all these reasons, it is not surprising that no one has. I move to myth number 4. The 9/11 Commission, which has endorsed the official account, was an independent, impartial commission and hence can be believed. One needs only to look at the reviews of the 9/11 Commission report on Amazon.com to see that this assumption is widely held. Perhaps this is because in the preface, the Commission's chairman and vice chairman tell us that the Commission sought to be independent, impartial, thorough, and nonpartisan. But these terms do not describe the reality. The Commission's lack of impartiality can be explained partly by the fact that Chairman Thomas Kean, most of the other commissioners, and at least half of the members of the staff had serious conflicts of interest. The most serious problem, however, is that the executive director, Philip Zelikow, was essentially a member of the Bush-Cheney administration. He had worked with Condoleezza Rice on the National Security Council in the administration of the first President Bush. Then, when the Republicans were out of office, he and Condoleezza Rice wrote a book together. Then, when she was named National Security Advisor for the second President Bush, she brought him on to help with the transition. Finally, then, he was appointed to the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. So he was the White House's man inside the 9/11 Commission. And yet, as executive director, he guided the staff, which did virtually all the work. Zelikow was in position, therefore, to decide which topics would be investigated and which ones not. One disgruntled staff member reportedly said at the time, "Zelikow is calling the shots, he's skewing the investigation and running it his own way." Accordingly, the Commission was not independent from the executive branch. Insofar as the Commission was supposed to be investigating the failure of the Bush administration to prevent the attacks, the Commission was no more independent and impartial than if Dick Cheney had been running it. The only difference was that no one was shot. Zelikow's ideological and personal closeness to the Bush administration is further shown by one more fact that until now has not been widely known, even within the 9/11 Truth movement. I mentioned earlier the Bush administration's National Security Strategy Statement of 2002, in which the new doctrine of preemptive warfare was articulated. The primary author of this document, reports James Mann in Rise of the Vulcans, was none other than Philip Zelikow. According to Mann, after Rice saw a first draft, which had been written by Richard Haass in the State Department, she wanted something bolder and brought in Philip Zelikow to completely rewrite the document. The result was a document that used 9/11 to justify a very bellicose foreign policy. We can understand, therefore, why the Commission, under Zelikow's leadership, would have ignored all the evidence that would point to the truth, that 9/11 was a false flag operation intended to authorize the doctrines and funds needed for a new level of imperial mobilization. The suggestion that 9/11 was a false flag operation brings us to myth number 5. The Bush administration provided proof that the attacks were carried out by Al-Qaeda terrorists under the direction of Osama bin Laden. One of the main pieces of alleged proof involved the claim that the baggage of a Mohammed Atta, called the ringleader, was discovered at the Boston airport from which Flight 11 departed. This baggage, besides containing Atta's passport and driver's license, also contained various types of incriminating evidence, such as flight simulator manuals, videotapes of Boeing airliners, and a letter to other hijackers about preparing for the mission. But the bags also contained Atta's will. Why would Atta have intended to take his will on a flight he planned to fly into the World Trade Center? There are also many other problems with this story. We seem to have planted evidence. Another element of the official story about the alleged hijackers is that they were very devout Muslims. The 9/11 Commission report said that Atta had become very religious, even fanatically so. The public was thereby led to believe that these men would have no problem with a suicide mission because they were ready to meet their maker. But investigator-reporter Daniel Hopsicker discovered that Atta loved cocaine, alcohol, gambling, pork, and lap dances. Several of the other alleged hijackers had similar taste, reported the Wall Street Journal. The Commission pretends, however, that none of this information was available. While admitting that Atta met other members of Al-Qaeda in Las Vegas shortly before 9/11, it says that it saw no credible evidence explaining why, on this occasion and others, the operatives flew to or met in Las Vegas. Another problem in the official account is that although we are told that 4 or 5 of the alleged hijackers were on each of the flights, no proof of this claim has been provided. The story, of course, is that they did not force their way onto the planes, but they bought tickets. If so, their names should have been on the flight manifests. But the flight manifests that have been released contain neither the names of the alleged hijackers nor any Arab names whatsoever. We have also been given no proof that the remains of any of these men were found in the wreckage. One final little problem is that several of these 19 men, according to stories published by the BBC and British newspapers, are still alive. For example, the 9/11 Commission named Walid al-Shiri as one of the hijackers and reproduced the FBI's photograph of him. It even suggested that al-Shiri stabbed one of the flight attendants shortly before Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower. But as BBC News had reported 11 days after 9/11, al-Shiri, having seen his photograph in newspapers and TV programs, notified authorities and journalists in Morocco, where he works as a pilot, that he was still alive. But if there are various problems with the government's story about the hijackers, surely it proved its case about Osama bin Laden. Insofar as this belief is held, it is also a myth. Secretary of State Colin Powell promised shortly after 9/11 to provide a white paper giving this proof, but this paper was never produced. British Prime Minister Tony Blair did produce such a paper, but it begins with the admission that it does not purport to provide a prosecutable case against Osama bin Laden in a court of law. So, evidence good enough to go to war, but not good enough to go to court. And although the Taliban said that it would hand bin Laden over if the United States presented evidence of his involvement in 9/11, Bush refused. There are, moreover, other problems in the official account of Osama bin Laden. For one thing, in June of 2001, when he was already America's most wanted criminal, he reportedly spent 2 weeks in the American hospital in Dubai, was treated by an American doctor, and visited by the local CIA agent. Also, after 9/11, when America was reportedly trying to get Osama dead or alive, the U.S. military evidently allowed him to escape on at least 4 occasions, the last one being the Battle of Tora Bora, which the London Telegraph labeled a grand charade. Shortly thereafter, Bush said, "I don't know where bin Laden is. I really don't care. It's not our priority." Sometimes the truth slips out. In any case, the idea that the Bush administration has provided proof for its claims about Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda hijackers is a myth. I turn now to myth number 6. The 9/11 attacks came as a surprise to the Bush administration. Nothing is more essential to the official story than this idea. About 10 months after 9/11, FBI Director Robert Mueller said, "To this day, we have found no one in the United States except the actual hijackers who knew of the plot." There is much evidence, however, that counts against this claim. One type of evidence involves an extraordinarily high volume of put options purchased in the 3 days prior to 9/11. To buy put options for a particular company is to bet that its stock price will go down. These extraordinary purchases included 2 and only 2 airlines, United and American, the 2 airlines used in the attacks. They also included Morgan Stanley Dean Witter, which occupied 22 stories of the World Trade Center. The price of these shares did, of course, plummet after 9/11, resulting in enormous profits for the purchasers. These unusual purchases, as the San Francisco Chronicle said, raised suspicions that the investors had advanced knowledge of the strikes. It would appear, in other words, that those who made the purchases knew that United and American airliners were going to be used in attacks on the World Trade Center. The 9/11 Commission tried to show these suspicions to be unfounded. It claimed, for example, that the purchases for United Airlines do not show anyone other than Al-Qaeda had foreknowledge because 95% of these options were purchased by a single U.S.-based institutional investor with no conceivable ties to Al-Qaeda. But the Commission thereby simply begged the question at issue, which is whether some organization other than Al-Qaeda was involved in the planning. I'm not making this up. Also, the Commission ignored the other crucial point, which is that U.S. intelligence agency closely monitored the stock market, looking for any anomalies that might provide clues to untoward events. Therefore, regardless of who orchestrated the attacks, the U.S. government would have had intelligence suggesting that United and American airliners were to be used for attacks on the World Trade Center in the near future. Further evidence of advanced knowledge is shown by the behavior of President Bush and his Secret Service agents at the photo op at the school in Florida that morning. According to the official story, when Bush was first told that a plane had struck one of the Twin Towers, he dismissed the incident as a horrible accident, which meant that they could go ahead with the photo op. News of the second strike, however, would have indicated, assuming that the strikes were unexpected, that terrorists were using planes to attack high-value targets, and what could have been a higher-value target than the President of the United States. His location at the school had been more highly publicized. Therefore, the Secret Service agents should have feared that a hijacked airliner might have been bearing down on the school at that very minute, ready to crash into it. It is standard procedure for the Secret Service to rush the president to a safe location whenever there is any sign of danger. And yet these agents allowed the president to remain another half hour at the school, even permitting him to deliver an address on TV, thereby announcing to the world that he was still at the school.